So, Paul, welcome back. I'm so glad to talk to you again.
Thank you, Jessa. It's a great pleasure. And thank you for inviting me back to talk about this really tender topic, the beautiful paradox of vulnerability in heterosexual male sexuality. What a great
Yeah,
conversation.
it really, our first conversation, it just, I don't know, it was like the tip of the iceberg, but it really got me thinking about this and what I hear from clients,
Yes,
surprisingly much to my mind for men is how vulnerable sex feels to them. And so I really
yeah,
want to explore that. So, where do you
beautiful,
want to start with
beautiful.
like defining what does vulnerability even mean?
I think that's a great place. It's a good foundational place to start. So, I mean, when I think about vulnerability and sexuality and intimacy, my brain goes in two different directions. The first direction is the topic covered by, for example, Brené Brown in her book Daring Greatly, and also the research done by Peggy Kleinplatz about the brilliance of vulnerability, its ability to bring a real deep, extraordinary quality to our intimacy and our sexuality. So there's that paradigm we can dip slightly into, and then of course the great vulnerability of our biology getting hold of us and bringing us into our sexual maturity. Of
Mm,
course, it's different for men and for women, and probably a lot of what I'm going to say here with regards to boys and men applies to some degree for women.
hmm
But what I've identified is three specific periods of child, boy, man development, which expose us to very vulnerable states. Those are fixed states, and then fixed timelines. And then there are the flow experiences, which are vulnerabilities that can find itself in any of those child, boy, man states. We can talk a little bit about that, but I think it's useful to tell our listeners the origin of the word vulnerable, because we all have our own idea of exactly what
Yeah,
vulnerable means and
right.
our own experiences of vulnerability. Interestingly enough, it comes from the Latin vulnus, which is a wound, and vulnerare, which is to wound. And I think when we consider it in the realm of intimacy and sexuality, there are three primary portals to look at. First of all, to agree that we can all be physically and or emotionally wounded. Secondly, that we boys and men are open to temptation and persuasion, and so we can be exposed to adversity, which can be very um, challenging through the vulnerability of temptation and persuasion, because particularly as we spoke in our last conversation about how the hardwired for sex male brain is so distracted by sexual opportunity. And with that in mind, the third one is that we can also be susceptible to exposing others to adversity or harm. And we spoke also about
Yes.
that with regards to what I like to call the intoxicated masculine, which is probably mostly found in the dark triad, let's say the narcissists, sociopathy, and Machiavellianism. When you overlay those personality traits onto the intoxicated sex brain, then you have behavior that has been described in the general terminology of toxic masculinity. But you and I had the discussion of why I find it more useful to refer to it as intoxicated masculinity. It's
Yes.
kind of a drunkenness, and there's a way through understanding it, and there's a way to healing that rather than just using the outright word
Right.
toxic.
Right.
If you would allow me, I wanted to pivot to Brené Brown's wonderful explanation. And this is a broad definition of vulnerability out in the world, not so much
Okay.
into the degree that Peggy Kleinplatz has gone into it from intimacy and sexuality. And I'll just read two paragraphs from my chapter on vulnerability, just to set the tone, and then to keep in mind that those who are seeking transformation, or couples who are seeking transformation, are trying to head towards this place that I'm talking about and that Brené Brown is speaking to. And then we'll dive into the three stages, the fixed stages and the fluid vulnerable states, and connect this um, victory of vulnerability that Brené speaks to and that I'm speaking to, and the utter confusing and perplexing. If we can, we'll be able to connect those two parts together.
Perfect.
So I write, when we are willing to be vulnerable to this surrender of each unfolding moment without the old control, anxiety, and fear, we meet ourselves and others quite differently and offer ourselves a new and developing relationship with vulnerability. Here we open the discovery of a vulnerability that is not paralyzing but empowering, not confusing but engaging, wherein we locate a deep resource that accords access to the optimal indices described by Peggy Kleinplatz, the extraordinary sexual connection. And then I go on to speak about Brené Brown. In her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead, Dr. Brené Brown aptly defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And yet, she says, it is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. I go on to write, renegotiating our relationship to vulnerability lies in the profound willingness to understand and embrace this paradox. How we choose to inhabit vulnerability, and how, with this new awareness, it will no longer be felt as disempowering, but will strengthen and expand our capacity to be intimate with our partner. So that's kind of where we're heading. And this is where I like to, in the therapy space, um, give context to the client that there's a direction that we're going to move in, and then we can start to unbundle. And the unbundling starts with the beautiful question that you've asked me, is like, what is this? What are the three stages? How do they present confusing and paralyzing states for us, put us in vulnerable situations, which make us feel insecure and unsure of ourselves, not only when it comes to being sexually active, but when we're invited as heterosexual men to step up more fiercely into that intimate space. How do we do that? And what do we need to unknot in order to do that?
Yeah.
So the first state that young boys, boys, are exposed to, which is the vulnerable state, is the latency period. So that's age 6 to puberty. And here we're busy contemplating imagined sexual performance. So there's anxiety about the impending. Maybe we've got an older brother or sister. Maybe we've seen our parents be intimate and we're wondering, what the heck is that all about? And I don't have the tooling, the mechanism. I don't know what that is. That's like
Yeah.
completely overwhelming. We can also not forget those children who are vulnerable to sexual abuse. So that's
Yeah.
a different kind of vulnerability. And according to the stats, that often happens in homes where there is a step parent,
Yeah.
interestingly enough. So that was the first phase, latency period. The second phase is puberty. Now, there's vulnerability that comes online surrounding our peers and early sexual encounters with our peers, and how we're going to perform. What is the what does a girl's body mean? What does it look like?
How does this thing
How do
work?
the parts work?
Yeah.
Where's the user's manual? Uh, or user is not a good word in this
Right,
case,
right. But
but
where's the on switch? Yeah.
where's the manual to explain the on switch? And here, interestingly enough, um, according to my own research, we start to develop our what I call our emotional sexual hardwiring. These are the meaning making mechanisms
Mm,
through meta themes such as um, learning how to be silent and secret about our sexuality, learning how to be self disciplined about our sexuality, but also we develop emotions around our sexuality. So these would be shame and guilt, and then an overall vulnerability around what it means to be a sexual boy. How do we contain this incredible testosterone tsunami which comes upon us? It's like a new thing. We've only just found some sense of reckoning with childhood, and now we're lurched out of it into this next mechanism. And so we carry these emotional sexual hardwirings with us into adulthood. And these are identifiable, and they're often the parts that we look at as therapists around what I call a frozen adolescent sexual energy that we
hmm.
bring into our adult space. And then the third is sort of ongoing adult sexual lives. So our ongoing vulnerability. And the thing that I would highlight there is the overriding cognitive vulnerability that we relent to around being distracted by sexual opportunity and sexual thoughts, both through habit, but primarily through biological design. As we spoke about
Hmm.
last time, our fantasies are different than women's fantasies. We have a larger medium preoptic area, so we're looking 2.5 times more often at what's available out there than women do. Um, it's also really important to mention that in this day and time, we spoke about tech before we logged in, social media impacts all stages
Hmm.
and creates incredible vulnerability for us as men and women too. There's the porn industry, there's the incel, involuntary celibacy movement, and this tends to both of these, but other things too, tend to gray our sense of expectation and entitlement as
Yeah.
men. When we get out into the world, we have been impacted by these mechanisms, the mechanisms of porn and the points of view of men, for example, who feel hard done by that they're not getting enough access to women, they're not having enough sex. So these are three timelines where we can identify strongly that men experience vulnerabilities and develop insecurities around these vulnerabilities, which we carry into adulthood.
Yeah.
And then we have the fluid vulnerabilities. The fluid vulnerabilities can show up anywhere in these three stages. For example, feeling constantly tempted um, for sexual opportunity and stimulated for sexual opportunity. For example, feeling threatened by losing self control puts us into a very vulnerable state. Then there's shame and guilt and the burden of secrecy.
Mm.
And then a very common one is feeling that we lack insight and that we might be sexually inadequate, particularly during adolescence. So we have the fixed three stages. We've got 5 or 6 fluid stages. These are all pointing us towards feeling
Yeah.
tender and feeling vulnerable as boys. And overall, I would say that the hijacking of the drive of our cognition, of our awareness from on a day-to-day basis can result in in a low-grade sense of overwhelm. On the
Yeah.
one side of the spectrum, you have feelings of trepidation, anxiety, and intimidation. And on the more extreme side, you have like dread, panic, and utter terror for this new state that has inhabited the body. And the funny thing, what I've discovered in the therapy space is that a lot of these feelings of overwhelm, dread, panic, trepidation, they are diluted by the constant ability of the success of ejaculation. In other words, there's a diminishing effect of these overwhelms because we can always go back and feed the anxiety by masturbating, by feeling okay about ourselves. Of
Mm.
course, this turns into a complexity when we're actually called upon to be vulnerable, to be in an intimate state, because a lot of these overwhelming feelings are never integrated with our psyche. They
Mm.
remain in our orbit, unreflected upon. And so they can come out when we are faced with a real live woman who's calling on us to be authentic, to be real. And part of the difficulty with that we have as men is that when, as boys and our brains are developing, when we experience these real physical traumas, because Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, these emotions don't just live, between our ears, they live in our bodies.
Mm.
So we develop coping mechanisms and we cover up and we develop defense mechanisms and we get into a self-control state. And so the primary issue here is that we deny our feelings and we don't develop as best an intimacy with ourselves as we could. And often that forms a baseline for being able to interpret when our partner says, I'd love us to be more intimate. And I think I mentioned to you last time, a man came to the therapy space. I said, why are you here? How can I help you? My partner wants me to be more intimate, but I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not an uncommon comment for a man to make.
Right.
So I'll just finish off by saying it's the challenge of of dealing with a survival state in the heightened sexual arousal state. It's that challenge that keeps us away from authentically trying to find out what is going on with our feelings, our emotions, being able to express them, knowing the alphabet of what those emotions actually are. That becomes the grist for the mill in
Yeah.
the therapy space for reaching into the beautiful, tender spaces of vulnerability and reaching into that place that I spoke about, that I read out, and that Peggy Kleinblatt speaks to and Brené Brown speaks to, the great victory of
Yeah.
vulnerability.
So I want to ask you to speak to the difference and or overlap with insecurity and vulnerability. Because listening to you right now, I'm thinking that vulnerability is shaped out of insecurity in a way, but then we can transform that into tenderness and openness, and that's a victory.
Yeah,
Are you thinking along those lines, or how would you
yeah,
delineate these things?
yeah. I like the question because they're not really the same. But the 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 way that I understand it, the way that I understand insecurity is to form, and there's an overlap between insecurity and vulnerability. But for much of the evolution of an insecurity, my sense is that it stems from a vulnerability that was un undealt with.
Mm,
So a remaining vulnerability
yeah.
that stays and
Sort of
lingers
in
along,
trenches, right? Yeah.
and it entrenches, and then it never really gets asked about until vulnerability is invited, or simply any sexual engagement is invited. The development of shame, let's say, around an early sexual engagement for a boy that has never been taken to therapy or reflected upon, or has never been given a second set of eyes and ears to give a second opinion about, um, that can be translated into how a man approaches a woman, or how he is with a woman in the intimate space. So that shame that he carried from having in his mind done something inappropriate or wrong or whatever becomes translated into an insecurity, by virtue of his behavior. But it's a baseline sense of not feeling good enough in that particular realm. Now, um, it's interesting also that one of the primary insecurities, I would say, at this point for men is pornography, the false uh, the false way in which men understand pornography to be a real filming of something that's actually going on,
Right. So
and
trying to live up
not
to
a
those
stage, and
expectations.
try to live up to that expectation.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, um, if there are functional issues for a man like ED, or a PE, premature ejaculation, then it's appropriate to have insecurities around that. And often the insecurities help a man go and get help
Right.
around that instead of staying insecure. And the other thing I would say about insecurity is, if you flip insecurity on its head, often we bring life's insecurities into our sexual behavior. For example, often men would say they have a high sex drive, but what is being expressed is the need to self soothe or reduce anger or stress through ejaculation. And they have found that it is a fantastic pharmacy, um, to just still things for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have, turning the insecurity of life into sexual compulsion. But I do think that a lot of insecurities are born out of a primary vulnerability state.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with that.
You know what? It totally makes sense to
Yeah,
me. And I guess I'm so struck by, I mean, just in talking to my own clients, like sometimes strong insecurities that make someone feel so vulnerable to be sexual. They're so
yeah,
worried about their performance or whatever.
yeah,
Um, but the flip side of this vulnerability is like, wow, I can be totally open and honest and let you see me and let you know those worries and
yeah.
connect with you in a much deeper way. Like there's a transformation available, right?
It's
So,
it's phenomenal. Yeah.
so what's the first step? Is it talking to your partner about what you're actually worried about and this vulnerability you're feeling? Or how do you see that progression from I'm so disconnected from my own emotions and still living in this insecurity of
Yeah.
shame or whatever. And wait, I can truly connect with you.
So that that's an important question that you're asking, because so I assume that you're asking, how does a man reach reach forward
Yeah, I
to a
think
woman?
both actually. How does
Or
a man start this process and how could
okay.
a female partner invite that maybe or ask about it?
Yeah.
I guess it could be both
Okay.
sides, right?
Okay. Well, let's start, for example, with a woman, because often it is a woman sort of reaching across the aisle, wishing, hoping, feeling deeply, and not being reciprocated for by her man. So the the steps that a woman can take is to first of all step back and to realize that it's likely that the man that she's with has not had a positive experience with vulnerability or being vulnerable.
Yes.
So there's a bit of a kid gloves approach that's necessary. And the the approach taken can come in a very generative way if it comes from a place of curiosity, no shame, no blame, never talking in public about the issue, um, creating a safe environment for him, and in a way going step by step and letting him know that no answer is necessary immediately, because often it's good for both men and women to let the other know that something is up or that they see something, and to give space.
Hmm.
It's quite intimidating and quite vulnerable to be standing there and have to,
Right. Come up with an
give an
answer.
answer. So I like the concept of kind, clear, compassionate conversation. Kind, clear, compassionate conversation goes something like this. There are three possibilities. It goes, my love, something is up for me. Um, I don't know what it is, but I'm coming back at 3:30. You always have to say when you're coming back. That's very important. I'm
Yes.
coming back at 3:30, and I will have been able to think more into it. That's the one option. Second option is, my love, something is up for me. I can share this much with you. The rest I'm coming back at 3:30 to tell you. And the last one is, my love, something has dawned on me. Um, I don't have a clue what it is, um, but I'm coming back at 3:30. Did I say that one first?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay. So sorry. So the third one would be, my love, something is up for me. This is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
So
don't need to answer now, but sit with that, and then I'll come back at 3:30.
yeah,
We
and
can
then
continue.
I'd like you to respond. That's up for me.
Yeah.
The other thing that couples can try, and then I'll move on to the man, is that um, in sharing bed space, intimate space, is pillow talk.
Mm,
Is just sharing what happened during the day. Um, and it should be about feelings and not data. Or it can be about data, but this is, this I went there, I did this, and this is how I feel about it.
yeah.
And to practice listening and not fixing.
Right. Right. Before you go to men, I do want to say I think it's a really important invitation for the women in here to see the vulnerability behind what appears perhaps like an impenetrable wall, right? Like
Yeah,
probably these partners are not looking vulnerable. It's the last
yeah,
sense you're getting from them. They look tough as nails and unemotional. And so to
yeah,
imagine, like to invite women in to see behind, through that wall, there really is vulnerability, and to treat it
yeah.
gently like that, right?
Beautiful.
To even if we can't sense it yet.
Yeah, spot on. And that has a lot to do as well with the old rigid masculine ideals and gender definitions that
Right.
actually many women expect their men to be stoic, and that vulnerability is not sexy for men. And also, heaven help me if he becomes vulnerable, because I'm going to have to be vulnerable too.
Yeah.
Eek.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say um, the original contract for couples who don't really want to change and who didn't start off with vulnerability in the first place may not be growing vulnerability. It
Right.
may not it may not work out well. But certainly for couples who are keen on transformation, the steps towards sharing more authentically um, must surely be the first step on the long, beautiful spiral dynamic road, rather than the looping mundane road of getting to deeper communication and what Peggy Kleinblatt speaks to as extraordinary sex.
Right. Okay. For the men's part.
So, because we experience, as I think you've delineated quite well, a, a moderate amount of stoicism when it comes to vulnerability, expressing our emotions, it it feels, and I'm talking on behalf of men here, and perhaps I shouldn't, but it feels incredibly important to know that we have a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And so that relates to some of the things I mentioned about what women shouldn't do, which is judge, expect an answer quickly. Um, Also useful for her to know what kind of anxiety is tied up in the question that she's asking. And there, it's useful for her to, as Brené Brown says, have done her own work. Of
Right.
course, there are always surprises, and it's useful for us as men to do our own work as well. But having a partner that invites vulnerability can make and does make all the difference. So that's the first thing I'll say. It's not an absolute necessity that that exists before the man gets going with vulnerability, because if
Yes.
he's really courageous, he should just get going with vulnerability, and he might be the one inviting her into that space, which she may have avoided for a whole number of reasons, and she may be waiting to be invited. So that's a beautiful thing.
Right.
So here are some things that men can do on their own and with the help of other men or groups. The first thing is stop watching porn.
Yeah.
You can ask me about that afterwards if you want to, but I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Um, Stop watching porn. The second thing he can do is to find out his relationship to his orgasm. On a deeper sense, that means, as we spoke last time about the hardwiring of heterosexual uh, men, on a deeper sense, it means find out the mechanism that runs your sex drive in your body. Become a
Mm.
master of that. One of the quickest practices is to have sex for a week or two and not ejaculate,
Mm.
and find out what goes on for you.
So does that mean separating from, would you call it, the medicine cabinet? The self-soothing, the
Yes,
release of
yes,
ejaculation as an anxiety soother, or dealing
yes,
with life's. Okay. So if we take that away, that
yes,
answer away, what comes up?
yes. And also, if it's not just a masturbatory practice, then if you stop orgasm with your partner, then you're not heading somewhere. You're not trying to get somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it also opens the door to an opportunity to understand what she is offering you in a much deeper way. There's less distraction
Because you're taking
in
your
the
eyes off
in the love
this.
making. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So that's the second thing. The third one is become aware of your emotional sexual hardwiring. These are the things we spoke about earlier with regards to all of the emotions and the meta themes that arise during our adolescence, that not only follow us and give meaning to how we see our own sexuality and the world as a sexual place, but they also, for better or worse, bleed into the meaning that we make of ourselves as men in our adulthood. So, really exploring why we put coping mechanisms into place, for example, will unknot, if we undo those coping mechanisms, they will unknot portals into deep vulnerability and connection with our partner. That allows us to be discovered by her, and also for us to discover more about ourselves where we had, let's say, brought the shutters down. So we're opening up now, we're letting the light in. So that's our emotional sexual hardwiring. And then we move into the outer spaces. What can we do outside of ourselves to find self-discovery avenues. We can find an older man or another man, for example, who we think has his life together or his relationship together. We can ask to be mentored
Mm-hmm.
by that man. We can go to therapy. We can join men's groups. The paradox of men's groups, as I've discovered for myself, is that the more I was able to share my deeper fears and anxieties with other men, the more easy it was for me to come back and share with my beloved.
It,
So
it does seem powerful to do this with men, a male therapist, another man, a men's group, right?
it does. It
Yeah,
does. Um, because as we spoke about when we connected the first time, it is important to have an ally who's got a sense of what you're talking about. Okay, because I don't know what it's like to be pregnant,
right,
to breastfeed. I don't know. I don't know. I can empathize, but I don't know in my bones, what it's like. So
right, right.
for that reason, yes, the help space with with men, if at all possible.
Yeah,
And then, as I mentioned, the practices, getting to where the rubber hits the road. So, pillow talk, sacred touch. The internet is filled with Eastern sexological practices, which are not necessarily about talking, although receiving feedback during these practices is a very, very important and wonderful tooling mechanism to develop a vulnerability, a risk taking, a courage with each other, um, and then learn about what Peggy Kleinplatz has identified as 8 important indices, primarily of vulnerability, um, and begin to get a sense of where you are on those scales. For example, how is your conscious communication? How is your communication during lovemaking? How is your presence during lovemaking? One of the reasons I said stop porn, you can't be making love to more women than all of your ancestors put together in one night
right.
and then come to your partner and be fully committed and fully present.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you're in a state of function, not a state of form. And I make no judgment about what I've just said. I'm
right, right.
simply saying it doesn't serve the road to transformation. And there are thousands of men who've gone into the village of porn and come back um, really dying to heal
Mm,
and dying to find out what else is there. This didn't do it for me.
right,
The most important thing, because of the tenderness of um, the tender space of vulnerability for us as men, is to carry ourselves gently. The testosterone brain doesn't do well with insecurity, doesn't do well with self judgment. So the practice of carrying myself gently, and it's wonderful if you have a partner who's able to co support, really does become a practice because a lot of the old narratives of getting it right first time
right.
um, have to go out of the window. So learn the Kleinplatz um, intimate 8. Be aware that the 4 indices, which had to do with um, body sensation, lust, and chemistry, were not the important indices when it came to the statistics. I think 600 couples. They were not the important ones
Yeah,
that makes for great or better sex.
yeah. I think just two more questions. We'll see. One of them, one of them is this tendency that I hear. I mean, we'll stick with heterosexual couples here from women to say, all you think about is sex. It's just about sex for you, as if it's a lowly desire. I think
Yeah.
it's as if it's just a physical release. You don't care who it's with. You're objectifying me, And there,
Yeah.
even for a man who maybe hasn't done this work, I think the women are missing the depth of vulnerability that this still involves for their partner. That is, I mean, physical release they can have by themselves, right? So I
Yeah.
was just wondering if you could speak to that, if I'm on the right track with that thought.
I think I think women cannot be, held accountable for feeling frustrated, that it appears that the man is only thinking about sex. I think that's simply a wonderful reflection of what biology does in intersecting male consciousness, and a wonderful success. I'll tell you a very brief story before I answer the rest of the question. My partner and I were at a birthday party recently of a 93-year-old man, and one of his good friends, a woman from childhood, was there, and she was asking about my book and the hardwiring of the male sex brain. And she said, "What a funny coincidence! I was at a party recently with this birthday man, and 93, and he was just running after all the young women." She said, "Can you tell me how that setup happens in the male body?" And so we spoke much like we did in our first talk together about the hardwiring, um, the looking, the distraction, etc., etc. And when I finished, she said to him, "What do you think about that?" And he said, "It's all a big F up. It's all a big F up," with a
Huh?
smile on his face. In other words, I can't help myself.
Right?
It's a big mess.
Yeah.
Um, and possibly also has gotten him into some trouble over the years. But it's useful for women, as I think you're suggesting, to know that something else is waiting to be discovered under that biological sexual hardwiring. Um, the magical elixir for women, oxytocin. I always say that we men suffer from a state of hypooxytocinemia, which is a reduced level of oxytocin. So for yourselves, it's easy to connect. It's easy to connect in the intimate space, in the not so intimate space. For us, either we learn how to do that, and that is absolutely possible, or sex is a natural mechanism for us to get to that place. And that happens because nature brings online hormones and neurohormones during and after sex. There's an Eastern saying that the way to a man's heart is through his penis, and the way to a woman's yoni is through her heart.
Ah.
Now, I'm sure they didn't know anything about physiology, but they were noticing behavior. And because biology imprints itself so strongly on us, I could say transhistorically again and transculturally, this is a truth.
Yeah.
So there are hormones, oxytocin, which is a cuddle, connect hormone, emotional safety hormone, attachment hormone, and there are endorphins, which bring about euphoria and mood regulation. And then there are the neurohormones, such as dopamine and serotonin. Serotonin causes relaxed states, drowsiness, reduced resistance to inauthenticity. It's like a truth serum almost. Um, and so all of these amazing elixirs come along during and after sex, and they create a space where I call it a body de-armoring. There's a
Mm-hmm.
de-armoring of the male psyche. I would layer the physiology with some psychology. We have now made love. Um, a man can feel a sense of great accomplishment if he feels appreciated. He can feel a great sense of relief, a beautiful sense of connection. And it's a moment in time where he's not thinking about having more sex or how he can get more sex. It's an opportunity of, let's say, hormone induced, but also a space where perhaps he's let down his guard, we let down our coping mechanisms. Things may have gone pretty well. And now um, his female partner is able to meet him in the surrendered, warm, quiet place if he doesn't hopefully fall asleep, because
Right.
that's another biologically induced demeanor. To meet him in this place where she's been waiting for him. So yes, to
Yeah.
your question, all we think about is sex. Unfortunately, that's not through the entirety of our lives. Fortunately, I can attest to that, being 62 now. However, something is waiting to be discovered
Yeah.
in the man.
Well, and you're describing that even for someone who's not necessarily thinking about this or pursuing this, they are having a changed state through sex that is so much more than just what women mean by this, just sex. It's like it's an incredibly powerful, transformative experience, whether you're aware of what's happening or not. It is the way to their heart, right? Something really does happen
Yeah,
there that
yeah.
is meaningful.
I 100%. I think it's also important, Jessa, to mention that the saying all you think about is sex is not just saying, hey man, all you're thinking about is sex. It comes from years of being, maybe not by him, but objectified, being
Yeah,
seen as a sex object, being only viewed as useful as a sex object.
right.
Um, Underneath that comment, all you think about is sex could be a cry for recognition. Hey,
Yes.
there's a
See
human
me.
being
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Can you see me? And I think that's where the power of vulnerability rears its beautiful paradoxical
Yeah.
head, is the sustained generative, passionate, warm, kind relationship has its foundational basis on vulnerability and authenticity. And often women simply just would like to be seen.
Yeah. I love how you're putting this, that there's something really beautiful waiting for this couple on the other side of a remark like that, or an experience like this, or a frustration like this, that
Yeah,
there's so much potential, like right there, to see and transform that.
there's so much. And the last thing that I will say is that, I mentioned Jane Ward's wonderful book on the tragedy of heterosexuality. If we continue along the lines, because last time you said, why are you so positive about heterosexual relationships? I said, as long as we don't continue along the lines of what the romance industrial complex has been selling us and what we've taken in and believed and made as part of our understanding system, when we can drop those knots and really see the other person, allow ourselves to be seen, allow ourselves to be discovered, we leave the orbit of the romance industrial complex gratefully, thankfully. We leave that orbit and then we begin to fly, to build a plane while we're flying it. And that requires vulnerability and trust um, and deep authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you answered my last question, but I'm going to just say it so it's clear to everybody, or maybe you've got more to add. But one of the things I'll hear, or I perceive in clients, is that they've got to be the stereotypical male, whatever, in real life. And it's only in sex that they touch this tender, vulnerable space. So, not for everybody, but for some of them, it's like, this is the one place that I get to go there. And you
Yeah.
described all the biochemistry of it that I think makes sense. But is there anything else you want to add about why this is, sex specifically, physical intimacy, is so profoundly intimate and vulnerable for men in a way that maybe they don't access any other part of their life?
So that's a complex question for a last question, but I'll try and be succinct about it. I have a saying in my book. It's on the back page. I think it's on the back page. When we're able to change the way we perceive, understand, and embrace our sexuality in men, our entire reality changes. And that's because our entire reality, by dint of biology's impact on our consciousness, our entire reality is formatted around sexual context. I'm not saying it's entirely sexual, but it's formatted around sexual context. Who we think we are as men through the brilliance of this biological hardwiring has so much to do with our sexuality and who we think we are as sexual beings. Now, the beauty of having this safe space with a woman or with a man, the beauty of having it as we're talking about heterosexuals, is that when we practice, and I use the word practice loosely, but when we practice our vulnerability in this space, what we're actually doing is we are developing our sense of sovereignty around who we are and who we want to be. We're expanding the nature of who we are to the man who says, I can only be that way when I'm with my partner. To that man, I would invite the possibility that he seek out opportunities in the world outside to continue to grow all of, let's use, for example, Peggy's Super 8 indices of vulnerability. Continue to grow your focus, your empathy, continue to grow your big heart, continue to grow your communication, continue to develop yourself. Do not shrink back as the world invites men to do into
Mm-hmm.
the stoic, non emotional doer. Do not sink back into that. Try that out for 2 or 3 weeks and come back and tell me how you went. Tell
Yeah.
me what you bumped into. Tell me how you met a man who was open to that conversation. Tell me how you're going to meet him again and expand the conversation. So we're not used to building new relationships as men that have vulnerabilities unless we happen to meet men in men's groups, for
Right.
example, or in the therapy space. So I hope to a degree I've answered your question.
Well, you know how
Um,
it seems to me is that if a man is drawn to that vulnerability, that space in sex, one way to see that is his heart reaching for that vulnerability across the board, right? Like if it's so appealing there to understand it doesn't have to just be confined to the bedroom, right? That means you're it's a siren song for you, right? You're being called to it.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And because, as I mentioned, sex forms such a huge contextual part of our lives, our penises are designed to be front and center for us for a good number of years while our brains are forming. Our meaning making of the world is through opportunities, connections, intimacy, and all of that. It makes utter sense that the primary portal to our heart, if there is one, and I believe strongly that there is,
Yes.
if there is one, should be through lovemaking.
Yeah.
And the magnificent thing about intimacy in lovemaking is that you are in a practice of being focused and loving the moment, but you're also growing your humanity.
Yeah.
You're developing aspects of yourself that are really tough to develop in the outside world, but that you can bring to the outside world and find like minded people to connect with your heart. You can still be robust and dominant and have sexual prowess, but you now have a paradigm to play across. You're not
Yeah.
just a one trick pony. You're a magnificent stallion that's got all sorts of tenderness about you. And I'll tell you, in raising children, it's a very, very powerful orbit to model for
Yeah.
kids, particularly young boys, and especially girls. That
Yeah.
beautiful John Mayer song, fathers, be good to your daughters, for they will love like you do.
Yeah.
So it ripples.
Yeah.
Uh, our behaviors ripple.
Well, another fabulous, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Would you say again, in case people hadn't heard the first episode we did, what your book is, where people can find it, anything else you want to let them know about how to reach you?
So the book is on Amazon. It's called Sexed, Hardwired by Nature, Evolving by Choice. I'm sure you'll put that
I will.
in the show notes. And the book is a workbook for couples. It's a workbook for men, kind of an A to Z of how to get to a more transformational place in yourself as a man and with your partner. And it's a workbook for therapists who would like to have some tips and ideas on how to reach deeply into the men they're sitting with, particularly if you are a woman therapist, to give you a little bit more insight into what it actually feels like in a felt sense way, who that man sitting across you could be, what he could be thinking. What are some questions you could ask that you wouldn't have dared to ask before, and how that could blow his heart open, his mind open, and give his woman partner a wonderful new vista into the person she connected with in the first place. So thank you, Jessa. It's
Oh,
been
you
an
are welcome.
absolute treat.
It
I
always
appreciate
is.
you.